Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of your favorite online show, Business and Banking Dialogue, a daily online show discussing on relevant topics with SME subject matter experts in the world of finance. My name is KK, and I'm the host and moderator for today's show. Our topic of today is about M&A. M&A is mergers and acquisitions. So M&A in a changing economic landscape is what we're discussing about. So, we've been hearing or seeing or reading in newspapers and magazines about mergers and acquisitions. So today's topic is all about knowing into more details about what is mergers and acquisitions, what are the strategies that go around it in making this as a boardroom discussion. As they say, animal spirits drive companies' survival. So just like Charles Darwin's theory of survival of the fittest, only the stronger companies survive in the end. And dinosaurs, the weak ones, will cease to exist. An alternative to survive is mergers and acquisition. And it is inevitable part of a company's life cycle. So to hear all about M&A in the financial world, let's invite Mr. Jaspal Bindra to this online show. Welcome, Mr. Bindra.
Thank you.
Yeah, good to see you again, sir, and to discuss about M&A in the financial world. We are on the threshold of a major milestone. That is 50th episode is next week, Monday. It's been a non-stop show since it began. So can you share some thoughts on this milestone that we are about to achieve?
Now, I would like to congratulate EPS. I think you're doing a very good service by bringing so much of experience and expertise to the reach of thousands of people every day, and to have the commitment to conduct a session every day for the last so many days, and now reaching your 50th milestone is a wonderful thing. And I wish the 50 will convert to a century and beyond. So all the very best.
Thank you, Mr. Bindra. Thank you for your words of encouragement. I would also take this opportunity to thank our participants. Thank you for being our support and showing solidarity with the COVID warriors through these testing times that we are currently going through. So about our guest, Mr. Bindra is an experienced banker. He was the CEO of one of the largest global bank, namely Standard Chartered, commonly referred in our parlance as Stan Chart. So he has also worked with Bank of America, and Union Bank of Switzerland. Currently, Mr. Bindra is the chairman of Centrum Group. Mr. Bindra, the terms mergers and acquisitions are often used interchangeably, and although they hold different meaning, isn't it? They do hold different meanings, mergers and acquisitions. Could you just briefly touch upon these two aspects?
Yeah, so actually, everybody gets very caught up on the merger and acquisition as an independent it's another tool for growth. You can grow through organic means, you can grow through mergers and acquisitions, you can grow through entering new businesses, which need not have a merger and acquisition involved in that. But when we talk about mergers and acquisitions, largely when it is a predominant single party buying the other, then clearly that becomes an acquisition, and in most cases, the identity of the acquired company gets lost. In the merger, it's more a partnership of equals or close to equals, and where even though they end up with one name, but a large part of the speciality in each of the two companies that merge remain. And even sometimes the independent brand names within product brand names, market brand names remain. So I think that's the big difference in terms of the terminology. They are both sort of trying to create a sum of two parts being larger than the individual's pieces. And clearly sometimes it's two, sometimes it could be that there have been multi organizational mergers and acquisitions as well.
Okay, thank you. So, Mr. Bindra, what drives M&A activity?
So several reasons, predominantly it's about growth that drives M&A. So you quoted the survival issue. So yes, it extends all the way from where you feel that your current position is being challenged and will not be sustained. And so you need to add on either a new geography or a new segment or a new product or a new technology, etc. To the way where you're already a dominant player and you want to consolidate and become even more, make your market position even more secure. So that's the range of what drives the M&A activity. However, what we often miss is that, and it's not a secret, but mergers tend to fail. Most mergers tend to fail. In fact, there's a KPMG study which suggests that 83% of mergers do not boost shareholder return. And in fact, 2/3 of the mergers that take place lose stock market value. So clearly, it's not a short win approach that you can take. And the reasons are many, but mergers are often driven for the wrong reason, and the wrong reason is fear. When companies fear that they're going to get drowned in globalization, or they're going to get left out because of the arrival of a new technological development, or for many reasons in a fast-changing economic landscape, they will not be able to compete effectively. That is what drives most mergers and acquisitions. And when a company is acquired or when companies merge, the decision is typically based on a product or a market fit. And the employee differences between the two organizations are often ignored. CEOs that fail to recognize that employee issues are not easy to overcome, usually end up regretting it. And it has to do with communication challenges. It's got to do with employee retention challenge, cultural challenge. So whatever reason M&A occur, for whatever reason they get driven, and there are many, from growth of market share to new technology, new products, new markets, etc. It is critical that the decision makers take the intangible factors into account, because it's always very difficult to quantify the human side of mergers, but they are very critical. And that is why I think we end up with this unfortunately poor ratio. But clearly M&As are here to stay, and they will continue to thrive.
Thank you. So that's something of information to note, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Bindra says most mergers fail. 83% do not benefit the stakeholders, which is a serious thing, and 2/3 lose shareholder value. So something for us to keep it in mind and note about it. So give us some examples of some big M&A done in the past.
Oh, okay. In India or outside India?
Could be both. You could give us both.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just from the top of my sort of thing, the big ones, the recent ones, let's focus on those. There's been one very big one last year in the energy sector, which was Chevron, which is the second largest US energy company, which bought out Anadarko. Anadarko is a thriving shale oil and gas company. It was a $33 billion transaction. There was a big one also last year in technology, which is Hellman and Friedman from the US, along with a group of investors, bought out Ultimate Software for about $10+ billion. In healthcare, there was Santeen that bought out WellCare. I think that was $13-14 billion. Of course, I'm familiar with the financials one. There was BB&T, which bought SunTrust Bank for about $27.5 billion. Of course, there have been bigger ones in the more not so recent time. Walt Disney, 21st Century comes to mind. AT&T and Time Warner comes to mind, etc. Closer home in India, I think the big ones, most recently, of course, Walmart picked up Flipkart for about 16 billion. That was a biggie. In my time in Standard Chartered, I was involved in two big transactions for the Tatas, Tata and JLR. They bought JLR for 2.3 billion. They bought Chorus Steel for 8.1 billion. Another big one in India recently is Hindustan Lever buying out GSK Consumer Healthcare, yes, for 4 billion. So yeah, I mean, there is a lot of activity. It's a very rich and ripe ground. And I'm just mentioning very few. I mean, there are tens of transactions happening every month.
Absolutely. No, I just wanted a few because that sets the perspective. Participants can also know that these things have happened and these are really big, big deals. So it is said that, Mr. Bindra, that M&A activities are often cyclical in nature. Is that true?
It is, yes. M&A actually come in waves. There are M&A waves. So for instance, from 2008 till about 2013, there was very little M&A activity. This was post the global financial crisis. It took 3-4 years for the activity to pick up again. And each wave varies significantly. So there is no sort of common pattern to each wave. And within each sector and each large geography, the reasons are diverse. But they are very often characterized by some strong, by some very strong similar reasons. And that is, one is that typically it happens when the markets are strong. So, that is one common factor. It normally doesn't happen in depressed markets. It happens when there is thriving optimism about the future. So, unlikely we'll have an M&A during COVID scenario. So I think if you were to sort of take all these waves and then look for the common features, one of the critical things you will see is that they have been preceded by a tech or an industrial or some other kind of shock. So post shocks, people do get very insecure. And then, of course, it takes a little time, but soon after that, you will see big M&A waves come post a shock. So it is reasonable to assume that given what we are going through, will count as a black swan, unprecedented, big shock. And we could see a large spate in M&A activity a few years hence. They also occur when the economic and political climates are more stable. So that is why I said they are likely to happen in 2 to 3 years from now rather than immediately after, immediately in the near future. And they are normally, M&As are the waves are strongest when there is rapid credit expansion and stock market booms. It gives the CEOs confidence, it gives them optimism, and that is why. So the seed gets sown when there is a shock, but the execution happens when the confidence is sort of at a better level. And we've also seen very interestingly that in all these waves, which come every 3-4 years, and then they last 3-4 years as well, the takeovers that happen towards the end of that wave are normally driven by non-rational, is the herd mentality stuff, frequently self-interested managerial decision-making stuff. And those are the ones that tend to fail almost certainly. And that's why this percentage of the M&A success, which for the good part of the wave is actually quite high, but gets very badly spoiled later. So I think that's how I would talk about them coming in cycles.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. So there's no definite pattern when it is to happen, but when it happens, it's like lasting 3 to 4 years. So good one. So Mr. Bindra, can monopolies be built by acquiring? For example, had Amazon been successful in buying out Walmart, it would have created a monopoly in the e-commerce space.
Yeah. So most of these mergers and acquisitions obviously create scale and size.
Yes. Yes.
And it is sort of in theory fair to believe that as the balance shifts to the producer rather than to the consumer, it is less in the interest of the consumer in whichever sector. Now, of course, there are many sectors that are regulated where it is more difficult to achieve total monopoly because the regulators won't allow it, whether it's in financial services or healthcare or energy companies, etc. But clearly there are other areas like tech, etc., where there is less of that today, less regulation to prevent monopolies. But typically, I don't think so. We normally get monopoly. Monopolies are largely still very much those that exist in the state control. As soon as it gets private, if there is a business that is worth doing, free capital will allow others to come in and compete. So yes, you may have an advantage for a while by consolidation, but somebody or the other will come to disrupt or steal market share from the large players. But of course, the state can, by diktat, create monopolies. Typically, what does get created is more oligopolies. So like today, what we have is there are a few large pharma companies that have huge influence around the world. We have a few large energy companies which have a huge determination of supply of energy and energy products around the world. So I think like that, there was a time when a few financial institutions had a lot of say. This is pre-2000, 2007, 8. That probably changed a bit now. So I think, yes, there is, and we can argue about monopolies being detrimental to consumer preferences, but a lot of efficiency comes in through if they're well managed. So I think we can leave out state ownership as a monopoly, which may or may not. But in the private enterprise, if you have scale and you have larger, like in medicine, clearly the ability for the large firms to invest in research and development would not have been possible if the same company was split into 25, and each one, they wouldn't have done 1/25 each. But when you combine the 25 together, they can clearly do more than 25 times what each one would have done. So I think there are benefits, but obviously there is a risk to consumer interest being put a little bit at stake.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bindra. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think the few explanations that Mr. Bindra has given has put the perspective very clearly on M&A. How does it work? What is the cycle period? Do mergers actually work, or don't they work? And there are many other issues we did talk about. We talked about quite a few big deals, massive deals that we talked about. And so those are very interesting things that are happening in the financial and in the non-financial space. So, yeah, this being a topic of general interest to many of you, I would request you to please put in your questions in the Q&A box. Or if you want to ask a question directly to Mr. Bindra, you could do this also. And someone from the back office will enable you to do that. Thank you very much. So, Mr. Bindra, these are COVID times. So many of the companies are, just fighting to survive, or they may have even collapsed quite a few. Is it a good time for M&A activity to begin? And because of all that is happening across the globe?
I think, just like in every other shock or dislocation in the market, there has been the initiation of M&A ideas. I think we will have equal, if not more, this time. And I say that with some conviction because I think the landscape for M&A is just got bigger. I think a lot of people who were sitting on the fence and who were reluctant earlier in terms of being acquired may now look at the world quite differently and maybe more open to an alliance, partnership, being bought out, etc. I think on the valuation side, there will probably be more reasonable convergence now than was possible in some cases, in many cases earlier, because I think the expectation between the promoters or the CEOs of the operating companies and the investors was very far apart. Closer home in India, I would say that the government will have almost no choice but to expedite sale of PSU assets. And fortunately, we have a lot of value there, a lot of room to be doing that for a multi-year exercise. But I think the pace of that will probably speed up. I think there will be today for the first time some people who will say, I want to exit completely. It is not normally ongoing concerns. Don't think about that drastically in a firm binary fashion. But I think what experience people have gone through now, people have lived a life where they think, we really don't need all that. What are we chasing? What are we doing? Kind of thing. And there'll be some, at least the smaller, medium-sized businesses that will just say, I don't need to be in the business. There are people who can do it better than me. I can take what I get and then move on. The other thing is that also, I think for a while, the organic growth is going to be slow. So for that reason, some companies, just to maintain their growth trajectory, will probably have to acquire. Otherwise, they will fall short of their growth commitments. They'll fall short of their expectations from their stakeholders, and then clearly it will reflect in their share price, etc. It is no secret that there is a lot of, for the good and the right names in terms of investors, there's a lot of cheap or cheaper finance available. There is a lot of money doing the rounds around the world thanks to the stimulus by the developed world governments. There are trillions of dollars now at almost close to zero interest rate, doing in circulation for the first time, or in addition to what was there. So I think there is that. There was all this talk about people moving out of China for whatever reasons and relocating elsewhere. That will provide some opportunities. I think there are people from other countries, like Indian companies that had operations in China, and they may rethink given the government's stand, not just in India, but in the US, in Europe, etc. So I don't know, some combination of those might also play a choice. So I think in many ways, there is a lot that I think has made the landscape bigger. Of course, like I said, people don't jump into an M&A activity, but they form the idea that, we need to do something beyond organic growth because it makes sense. And then there is the whole lead time of trying to identify, trying to select, trying to rationalize in your mind, get consultants, get friends, get well-wishers, mentors to sort of explain to you and think about it, brainstorm, etc. And I think there will be that. There will also be consolidation for scale in certain sectors. I think real estate is very ready in India to get consolidated by the big corporate type operators rather than the individual entrepreneurial type. I think the same will probably be true for the travel industry. I think the small high street travel agent will probably disappear, and we will have the biggies who will sort of run that business. I think clearly in the non-bank financial services, whether it is banking, an NBFC or housing finance or MFI, we might see consolidation. People who have the capital and who have the ability to continue to grow will probably have choices in who they can wish to acquire. Similar things may be true for surface transportation. I think especially fleet of commercial vehicles, etc. The other interesting thing that I think will change the landscape in terms of make it largely bigger is there is expected, and we don't know how people will react after all this is behind us in a few months or whatever number of months it takes. But there is expected, as we sit today, to be a shift in consumer behavior, which might be more permanent than was earlier the case. And clearly the ones that come straight to mind is like buying online. So they might still buy from the Kinara Wala, but if the Kinara Wala doesn't offer it online, he is not going to be in that much business. So I think people have got used to, they found the convenience. We were earlier, you could just sort of make a phone call or send your chappy and it would come. Now, people have got there. I think the whole visual experience between OTT and theater is probably going to be tested. We don't know whether it will move 100% or nothing moves 100%. But I think there'll be a bias towards, people have just got used to watching a lot of their media visually on the tablet, and that might just become a habit. I think working from home will be a new phenomenon, I think, for commercial establishments. And I think, again, there will be only a few companies that can move 100% to work from home, as some technology companies have announced. But almost every company, from the most brick and mortar to the least, will have some variation of work from home, I think, seeded now. Because it has both economic, environmental, and I think people have now tested whether it's effective or not for their company. And I think from the people I speak to, many find that almost everything that was being done earlier has got done. So not so much has suffered. What has really suffered is the sales elements, where the reach to the customer is impossible in this environment. So I think that is different. And of course, the big firms, as usual, will want to buy market share. They will have more vulnerable targets to be able to acquire. They will have more bargaining power. And so I think we will probably get a lot of activity. So yes, I gave a long answer to a answer that was yes, basically.
No, I think you have covered it so well. I think almost there is opportunity, although it's not good. If you look at it from another point of view, that during this troubled times, there is this problem. But if you look at it from a purely M&A activity, then these are the huge opportunities, according to Mr. Bindra. Almost every business is talked about has opportunities for M&A activities. So that's what it is. Shiva from Shiva P. Palancha asked a question, but I'm sorry, I just beat you to that question. I asked this question and your query came exactly at almost the same time, perhaps. Perhaps Mr. Bindra has answered your query, which is exactly what I asked about. Is it a good time? But if you feel there is something that you still need clarification, please feel free to ask that question once again please put your question in the chat box. Right. Mr. Bindra, what is the correlation between the economy and mergers and activity in any market?
So, as I said earlier, a lot of mergers and acquisitions happen when the economy is strong and stable. So clearly there is a timing to the economy, which is relevant for M&A. But typically the M&A thinking begins when things may not be as stable, but they get executed during stable times. The other relevance of the economy with M&A is that all of them require, there are very few M&As that get done by funds from within yourself. So very few companies go and acquire or do a merger with money that they themselves have sitting on their balance sheet, and they just use that, and they necessarily need to raise money. It may be against their own shares or assets or whatever. Of course, there are complicated structures like leverage buyouts, etc. But those are all have to be raised from the market. So it has to be a time when there is confidence, not just in the firm that wants to embark on an M&A, but also in the market for the future prospects of the combined entity, of the business in which that sector is. So I think clearly you need more than one hand to get this done. So I feel that in the rebound economies, post shocks, is when these things happen. I think like the 2007, 2008, we saw the activity pick up after 2010. But clearly, when you look at the activities that happened post 2010, they must have all been driven by thinking which should have started in 2008. But it takes a little bit of, so there is a positive correlation to the economy. But eventually decisions are made by companies, by CEOs in the outside world, by promoters in India. And they take, when they have the confidence, when they feel they have the risk appetite for taking a step like that, and when they can find the funding to complete the transaction they've pictured. I think that is really the combo.
Okay. So typically, what's the time period it does take to do such activity? I know there is no definite time, but average, how does it work?
Yeah. So they're reasonably, they're never straightforward. They definitely extend because there is first there has to be an idea, then there has to be a conversation. The conversations are very sensitive because many times you can't directly talk. This is a very equal merger. You can't really have that conversation till you have a little bit more built in. Normally, the conversations happen through a third party, through an investment bank or through a common director or through a known source, etc. So that has its own sort of time frame. And I think the M&A transactions split into two phases. So the first phase is agreeing in principle to explore or proceed with the transaction, with an M&A. And then there is the whole execution, which is the due diligence, the legal diligence, the arrangement of finance, the instruments to be used, the decision around management cadres, the board composition. Those are all the valuation itself. So that then becomes the procedural execution phase, which is the second. So typically, I would say that the second phase is very easy to determine the timing. There is precedent. You know how long typically a due diligence will be done. You normally use an accounting firm or an investment bank or a consultant to do that for you. You could, so you at least you get to the stage where the valuation has to be negotiated finally. I think that phase is known. The first phase and the negotiating of value, the last sort of closing bit, those are the uncertainties in an M&A transaction in terms of timing, and could take as much time. But I think you have to think about it in 3 phases.
Okay. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, we are really talking a lot of valuable information we're getting from Mr. Bindra. And there is so much to ask. There is so much to hear from him. So please continue your queries in the Q&A box, or you can ask directly. Mr. Bindra, I have a query directly from Sriram. He asked you a question. Recently Mindtree was acquired, right? And is that kind of a good takeover or a kind of a bad takeover? Is that something that is acceptable to the industry?
So I think, in specifics, it's very difficult to comment like that, because
Yes.
any M&A has got so many stakeholders. And the same thing that might look good to the shareholder may not look so good to the employee, or may not look so good to the management. So I think on a specific, it's difficult. I think if the question is more related to the fact that somebody from outside the industry sector is buying out something, then is that a smart thing, or it should always be done by people in the same segment? I don't know if that was the purpose of the question, but it could be. And but generally, I would say that again, the results on that are mixed. Mergers and acquisitions between counterparties from the same sector have been very successful and not so. And similarly, when people from outside of the ecosystem have come and bought out something, whether they're outside in terms of geography or outside in terms of the sector, again, there has been mixed results. There have been people who have bought into power businesses, or have bought into cement businesses and done very well. And there are others who haven't. The caveat is in regulated industries. There, I just think it would be impossible for somebody from the outside to come and buy, because the regulators will not allow it. They will want to have a track record or a license or some other eligible criteria. But in the non-regulated sectors, I think we've seen an equal number of people. I mean, this is not really an M&A not an M&A answer, but it sort of spells to the same. I mean, I often ask colleagues that if 25 years ago somebody had walked into General Motors or Ford Motor Company and said that, somebody who's never been in the car industry ever is in 10, 15 years going to build a car which is going to have 125% acceptance in terms of quality and performance, whereas Ford and General Motors have in the 70s percent. Is that ever possible? And I can tell you, I mean, I've never been on those two boards, but the answer would have been a resounding no. Because, for somebody who spent hundreds of years in the automobile industry, and they can still get a customer acceptance of only 70-75% on quality and performance, how could somebody like Tesla ever come and do that? But that's exactly what we saw. Tesla has done exactly that. And so I think there is room for, I think when people do it with a very clear understanding and a clear focus, and then sort of do the integration with the right sort of attention, because many times CEOs are just very happy to have ticked the box that they've done the big deal, and and their firm has become double the size and blah blah blah, and then sort of lose the adrenaline to continue monitoring the integration, etc. That gets delegated or outsourced, etc. And that doesn't work. But if somebody does that, and the serial acquirers actually have done very well at M&A. So if you look at GE is the best M&A player that the world has produced. And the reason for that is their whole business philosophy was on growing through merger and acquisition. And I don't know how many hundreds of acquisitions they've done over their history, but for a very long time, they were the most successful M&A. And actually, when they stopped, post Jack Welch period, they stopped using M&A as the only or the major growth sort of route. The company itself, since then, hasn't been at the forefront of the industry. So they've actually lost out. But that was a core skill they had developed, all the way from integration governance to a dedicated team to a steadfast focus on target realizations, using very standardized proven methodology, etc., and a very robust enabling infrastructure for acquisitions they had built up, legal, HR, finance, all of that stuff. So it worked very well for them for, I think, over 2 decades. And there are some others like that, but they stand out as the best such example.
Okay. I have a query from Eriniti Narayana. She says, he or she, M&A in India was typically cross-border inbound acquisition in the last few years. Are we likely to see cross-border mergers in any sectors? Shall I repeat the question?
Yeah, no, I hear it. I think she's right that some of the bigger transactions largely have been cross-border, and we talked about the Tatas, we talked about the Walmart, Flipkart, but there have been some big ones. If you look at Jayaprakash Cement having sold to Aditya Birla Cement, there have been quite a few within the country as well, but may not be in size because that kind of capital is not there with promoters. So the only ones who can do a big value transaction domestically would be either LIC or some such government institution. It's like ONGC has bought 51% of HPCL, which is a large value transaction. But mostly the bigger transactions have been done by cross-border. I think there is likely, as we've just recently seen in the Reliance Jio case, there is a lot of appetite from international cross-border investments into India. So I think that will continue and that will happen. I think, I can't sort of predict the future, but I would say that post this phase that we are going through, there will be a lot of appetite on both sides to acquire and to be bought out. So we should see a lot of activity. How much of it can be done through Indian capital is very difficult to say because, there's a lot of the Indian promoters are very leveraged and are going through, don't have the abundance of capital for acquisition. And are they able to, are they really ready to leverage further to buy out market share is a question that we'll have to wait for an answer post this, how things look post-COVID. But clearly there is a lot of money looking for India as a very attractive destination, very under-penetrated in so many sectors. So I think if I was to be taking a bet, I would say the cross-border is what will be the larger value. There might be many more smaller transactions within India, but the larger value transactions will be all still cross-border.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. I hope, Eriniti, your question has been well answered. So we talked about cross-border, which is the question that Eriniti asked. And now look, what about the, we also know that, industries, same industry, companies buying out, there is a great affinity to buy that. What about an industry, cross-industry? So what are your thoughts on LIC buying out IDBI?
So I think, honestly, and I don't want to sort of, I don't know enough in terms of the logic for that transaction because it's obviously known to the LIC and to the government. But it seems more like uh, a rescue effort for the government than a pure merit transaction. And I don't say that with any sort of full knowledge of the subject or of the decision. But clearly, if I look at the IRDA rules today, the insurance regulatory rules allow an insurance company not to invest more than 15% equity in any single company.
Okay.
And obviously that was changed for this transaction to 50%. So clearly it wasn't in the normal course of business. We know that IDBI was plagued by 31% NPA. So it was a cost that the government could not incur or bear. And so we have used this. So in the overall scheme of things, I don't think so that's a wrong thing. The government can use any instrument, any vehicle it chooses. LIC, after all, is 100% government, as was IDBI. So that is fine. But if we try to make this the role model example of an M&A, I don't think so. It's more an outlier, exceptional case than a good case.
Okay.
Would be my thinking. But
Sure.
to your question, can somebody from the insurance industry come in and do, a transaction in the banking? Absolutely. I don't think so. We've had those around the world in the past, and I think there will be more in the future. I think very industries which are kind of related. So within the financial services bandwagon, I think if one sector, insurance versus the banking sector comes together, I think that is very much, there's room for play there, 100%.
Yeah, I guess so, yeah. From a business point, I think there is a lot of room for play because banking and insurance go hand in hand. So, Mr. Bindra, you know that we also allow participants to ask a question directly to you. So we have the first question that is coming to you. Tyag, can you please unmute and ask a question?
Yeah, very good afternoon, Mr. Bindra. We heard you quite elaborate on M&A, including the global as well as the Indian scenario. And you have been part and parcel of big M&As in the Tata space also. Having said, I would like to understand, Mr. Bindra, with your vast pool of knowledge on M&A, is takeover different from acquiring? And what is hostile takeover? Can an unlisted company take over a listed company? And the final question, what is bailout takeover? Is it what you said in this earlier case of distress takeover? Over to you, sir.
Thank you. I think there are many questions.
Yeah.
But no, fine. I think broadly the answer to all of that is yes. I think all of those, the latter part of your question was about what all is possible and is unlisted company able to buy out a listed company? Of course, I mean, Warren Buffett is buying companies all the time, and he's a private company, and he's buying. Hathway is definitely a private company, and he's buying the biggest companies in the world and very large stakes in very big companies around the world by sector, etc. So I think that is possible. The first part of your question, which is what is different between a takeover and acquisition, clearly takeover is more a little bit less willing partner on one side. So, whether it is hostile or not could be another range of thing, but clearly it is something that you take somebody by surprise. You can either sort of do it through the markets, you can do it through change of one large shareholder to the other, so you can do a private deal with a single large shareholder in the company, or you can do it on the exchange. Now, clearly, the SEC in the US or the SEBI in India have lots of rules where, these are not easily done. So clearly, they will take a lot of resources and a lot of proper compliance to get it done. But yes, they are there. In the past, we used to see a lot more tendency for hostile takeovers. Now, I think the SEBI rules, SEC rules make it that much less possible for hostile. So they are mostly they get, but hostile is one extreme end. But many times when people are acquired, they are not happy. They are the whole thing is between reluctant to being bullied to being just at war kind of situation and getting taken over. So I think there is the whole range, and we've had cases within the range. But what people have realized time and time again, that value maximization is actually going to come through a combined transaction where both sides are willing to help each other to consummate a transaction. And and all growth capital normally get done only through a well mutually agreed situation. But yes, sometimes when there is land grab in terms of market share, there is still hostility between companies that take over, and there are some very good examples of those as well. So I think all will continue. I think there will be, but the shift has now been far more. The American movies that we see about boardroom, Wall Street, they are all about these hostile takeovers. I think they were from they were from my young days. I think the current environment is now more about scheming and planning and collaborating and trying to maximize value. So if you see what has happened with Reliance recently, I mean, no Facebook or nobody's interested in doing a hostile. They want to come and see, Reliance wants to maximize this value. They feel, they are entering a huge underpenetrated opportunity for many decades in the future. And, so they try to make the most of it and do it this way.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bindra. Thank you, Tyag, for the question.
Thank you.
Let's look at another role of another a big vertical, that is the PE, private equity firms. What is the role of private equity firms, financiers in the M&A space?
So typically, the participants that come between two counterparties that are considering to be merged or acquired via each other are really three. So there are PE firms, there are investment banks, and sometimes there are management consultants. These are typically the three type of fiduciary players that sort of act to make the deal happen. And PE firms, of course, in fact, all of them, and of course, this includes, I left out the big four accounting firms, but many more than the big four. The accounting firms also many times are very crucial in some of these transactions. So I think these are the four sort of players who play an active role. What they bring to the table is they bring expertise, financial expertise. They bring sector or domain expertise. They bring money, which is a critical ingredient to the transaction. And they allow you to validate your purpose of the transaction. Of course, it's often been said that investment banks are only interested in the fee. So they just want to do as many, as big transactions as possible. And their advice is biased in view of their own fee. The same cannot be said of the PE, because the PE, in addition to doing all the advice, also puts its own money where the advice is sought. So clearly they are in a, they have skin in the game, which investment banks don't have, or the accounting firms don't have. So I think that is one distinction between the players that come and help. So I think the consultants, investment bank, and the accounting firms are in one category, and then the PE firms are slightly in a different category. The PE firms also have a very important role, because not only do they, many PE firms have now joined the bandwagon for the Reliance Jio Infratel. And not only do they obviously help create a base value and bring money to support that, but they also have globally, some of these big guys who have come into this firm also have investments in similar sectors, similar industries around the world. So they give you a connectivity, they give you transfer of best practices advantage also, which also the investment banks and the accounting firms, which are global and large, are able to provide, the management consultants are able to provide. So I think in that way, they are more common. And of course, the advantage with the PE firms is that once they like what they see, they could be a repetitive investor. Whereas an investment bank or a management consultant has to go out each time and find new people. With a PE firm, you could have the same firm continue to grow. And we've seen that happen, in all the startup industry that has happened in India. A lot of people who came in, like Sequoia or Tiger Fund, etc., have continued to invest and reinvest and go much bigger. And that has saved the promoters the effort of having to cultivate on each round, having to cultivate a new investor base.
Right. Thank you. So, one question which I was expecting has already come. The mergers and consolidation, mergers from State Bank of India and subsidiaries into SBI, and the ongoing mergers of some of the other banks that are PSU banks going on. So the question from Mr. Prabhu is it a value destruction exercise, or is it too early to opine?
So I think, it depends. See, with most of these things, you can choose to justify it on either side.
Yeah.
Depend on whose viewpoint you share or you have sympathize with. You can sort of make it look like a damn good thing, or you can make it look like a really big disaster. And we could say the same about the 1966 nationalization of banks. We could say this about so many things that have happened in history, where but you can look. It's including the the rule of the English over India. I mean, there are some people who still say, "Oh, if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't have had the railway system, and we wouldn't have had the school system, and this and that." But most of us would say, "Hey, that's a small benefit for the sufferings that our forefathers and everybody else had at their hands." So I think there is a way of looking at this in both directions.
Yeah.
My own view on this is that I think we need, a country of the size of India in terms of its economic strength. Even more importantly, a country of the potential of India definitely needs very large financial institutions. Our financial institutions are really tiny in aggregate, and then in individual size, even more aggregate. Even more insufficient, in individual size. So I think there is definitely a need. Clearly, I think this is one step where the individual size problem is being solved. But I think the bigger problem that we lose sight of is we just need more banking capacity in India.
Yeah.
The banking capacity in India is little. When we read statistics like 85% of the MSME are not yet banked, or don't have have access to formal credit. I mean, that is really, MSMEs are 30 to 40% of our economy, and 85% of them still relying on family and friends to support themselves. That is a disaster. So I think between combination of state-owned banks, private banks, foreign banks, whatever else, but we just need a lot more banking capacity. So I would say that it's only a step that we are addressing, rather than look at it as a back. If you look at it purely from SBI subsidiaries being independent and running on their own and now being merged here, and are we really creating the scale, capacity, etc., then you could come to a different answer. But if you look at the bigger picture, that we have to have a lot of banking capacity, and for banking capacity to be that large, we need to have some really very solid single institutions in India. I mean, it's we don't have in the top 50 there is no bank from India. 50 banks. I mean, the top 10 banks in the world now, more than half of them are Chinese banks. So clearly you can see that there is something that they may have used the wrong means and approach to it, but they have achieved scale and capacity. The reason we have such a big manufacturing bonanza out of China is because they have credit that is available in that scale and size. Without that credit, you cannot, for any growth to happen in any country, what you need are two things. In the immediate, you need credit. And in the longer run, you need productivity. So the credit is the first step, and then you have to improve productivity. And that's how you're going to grow. Whether you're a company, whether you're a country, whether you're a nation, whether you are whatever, the universe. So I think credit is a big hurdle in India, and every such step, of course, it will have its challenges. When three banks merge in India, three PSU banks merge, there'll be overlap, so some employees will get hurt. There will be some customers who had limits from all three will suffer because they won't get 3 times the limit now. They will have to rationalize that limit. There'll be other problems in integration, etc., and it will take some time for things to normalize as they do normally with any M&A. But if you look at the larger purpose, if you take a 10, 20-year journey, and is this a requirement for us to get to that destination, then I think you'll be able to find more reasons to justify why this is necessary to do at some stage. We need, India deserves, forget about need, India deserves to have a few names that appear on the top 50 banks in the world.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bindra. So if you don't mind, can I hold you for another 2 or 3 minutes?
Sure.
Okay. So I think one aspect we have not spoken about is the culture factor in any mergers and acquisitions, and people being what is the most important factor in any organization. So what about the culture factor in an M&A kind of a deal, like say ABN AMRO, a wholesale bank buying out Bancam, a retail bank. I don't know whether you were there at that time. I was in ABN AMRO. We were like such a mismatch of cultures, And so your thoughts on that, just briefly.
Yeah, so I think it's very, very important. Being conscious of the cultures that exist is very important. Also, we do the maths when there are 2 different organizations and we try to put them together. What we don't think enough about is when the 2 companies merge, in the culture that then becomes the dominant culture of the one that acquires, is everything that is being done in that company going to continue to be done?
Yeah.
So I can give you my own example. When I was in Bank of America, this was much before the RBS transaction. And we were, at one time, the leading bank in the world, etc., etc. And when the transaction happened with the Nations Bank, Bank of America bought Nations Bank in effect, but actually it was a reverse merger. Nations Bank, Bank of America was going through a tough time, and it had to sell out, and Nations Bank bought it out. And the first statement that the chairman of Nations Bank made on national TV, because Bank of America was very international and Nations Bank was a pure domestic bank. And he said, the only bit of international that I'm interested in is California.
Okay.
So it's not that he wasn't aware that California is not international, but I think he was just making a point that, domestic America is big enough. I don't really need to go and look at markets that are well beyond the shores of America. And for a long period, that was how it was. And then, of course, they realized that, they are missing out, and they've again come back. But they've lost, in the years I was there, from the mid-80s to the mid-90s, the Asian franchise of Bank of America was far, far stronger than it is today. But they gave it up. It's the same thing that happened with UBS, which has happened with so many other banks. So yes, I think there is that situation that if you don't take care of the cultures, it is going to be very difficult if you're not fully you're giving away something which is hugely valuable, and you lose out on that. I think we've had some situations in the Indian acquisitions as well, the cross-border acquisitions, where there have been challenges. I think the Tata transactions, both of them, the Tatas were far more considerate and kept the international employees at senior positions for longer than any other Indian promoter would have done. But over time, those differences never reconciled, and and as performances in both Chorus Steel and in JLR over time, international JLR didn't do as well. Clearly, there was some bad taste in that situation. So I think it is tough. I mean, cultures to align them. I take a lot of comfort and pride from one transaction that I was involved in, which was the Grindlays Bank acquisition in India by Standard Chartered. I was then CEO India here, and it's probably one of the very few transactions that was success on every count, both from a Grindlays point of view and a Standard Chartered point of view. And I think the single largest reason is it was the same market, it was the same kind of people. The people who worked in Grindlays were no different from Standard Chartered or vice versa. They were from the same schools, colleges, government service families, small towns, big towns, etc. So it worked. The culture was very easy. There was no sort of element of alien in any fashion. And then thank God we had a good integration process and it worked very well. But as soon as you try to do something which is not as common as that, then it becomes very tough.
Thank you, Mr. Bindra. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to wrap up the show. But before I wrap up the show, I want to make a big announcement that EPS is completing 50 episodes on Monday. We had over 25 speakers, earned over 1 million impressions on social media, 500 plus viewers on most shows, most repeated participants. So on Monday, we are having a very special guest, a guest who has closely worked with the Prime Minister of India, Mr. Narendra Modi. He is Dr. Gulshan Rai, Chief Information Security Officer at the PMO. So we have a lot to learn from him as to how the government machinery works. And there are so many things to discuss on the cyber security and other things. So we will discuss and learn from a whole lot of things from his wisdom. So please join us on Monday at 3 p.m. And I take this opportunity to thank Mr. Bindra for the 49th episode, which is a stepping stone for our 50th. And we've covered so many topics, Mr. Bindra. It was so informative. I was really engrossed in the discussion that I had with you. And we have covered M&A, so easily and so simply that every participant, I'm sure, must have learned a lot in today's discussion with you. I once again thank you, Mr. Bindra, for coming, sparing time, more than the required time, and look forward to meeting you once again, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you.